Let's talk about Lyndon Johnson as he takes over for President Kennedy amidst the tragedy of President Kennedy being assassinated. And President Johnson had a lot of political experience, and his background was very well oriented with the way Washington, D.C. worked. He had been a member of the Senate for a very, very long time. He kind of worked his way through the Senate and just came as a Senate member, and then eventually just kept moving up, and eventually became the Senate Majority Leader, which is basically like the number two or three, depending on who's in charge, Democrats or Republicans. He was a Democrat, and so was Kennedy, but he becomes basically like the number two or three guy in charge of the Senate, which gives him a lot of power. And this is an interesting picture. You'll probably recognize at least one face here. Anybody remember who this guy is? Yep, Franklin Roosevelt. Now, don't worry about this guy, but this is President Johnson. But this is President Johnson when he was very young, and this is him meeting a President Roosevelt during, looks like it's on the back of a bat or like at a battleship, something like that. But again, he kind of worked his way up to becoming the Senate Majority Leader, which will give him a lot of ability to talk to the Senate when he becomes president and vice president, actually, because the vice president is in charge of the Senate technically. But when he becomes president, it kind of lets him be able to help legislation get passed a little bit easier. However, one of the things that people didn't really like about him is he would often bully people. He was kind of a big guy. He's tall, big guy. Um, and he would often bully people into doing what he wanted them to do. They actually had a phrase that they associated with him, and they called it the Johnson treatment, which would basically be he would be like a close talker. He'd get very, very close to you, and he would kind of like talk to you, kind of like talk down to you, maybe poke you in the chest, grab your arm, something like that. This is a picture of this. I think this is very interesting. Kind of a littler guy here is another senator that he's talking to, and you notice how close he is, and then he kind of talks to him, then he gets really close, and then kind of stares at him in his face. And this would be part of it. Now, if you notice, this guy's backed up against like the table. This was very common with President Johnson. He would kind of try to intimidate you to get his policies passed. This is another picture of him getting very, very close to another individual. He didn't mind doing that. That was kind of his way of doing stuff. And like I said, it literally came with a nickname, the Johnson treatment. And that was part of who he was. But he does take over after President Kennedy. And as far as passing legislation, he's going to pass several things. One of the things that he passes was something that President Kennedy was going to try to get passed, and that was the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 said this: it was illegal for employers to deny a job to someone based on their race, based on their gender, their sex, or their religion. So, what this basically meant is if you applied for a job and you were an African American, a place could not say you're not getting the job because you are an African American. They couldn't say that. They couldn't say that you can't get a job because of a you being a woman or a man. You couldn't get a job because you were a Catholic or a Baptist or a Methodist. And so this made it illegal for them to deny anyone a job. Now, eventually, there's going to be another Civil Rights Act that's going to be passed about a year or 2 years later that deals with allowing people from all races and all genders to be able to actually go to restaurants and not be told that they can't sit down. So this is the beginning phase of this, and this allows African Americans to actually be given jobs that they otherwise would not have had. Now, I will say this: there were still businesses that would still not hire people based on this, and they would come up with other reasons, but they just wouldn't say based on their race. So how do you find that stuff out? Well, you would go to the place where everybody's being hired, and if there's only white people that are being hired and there are no African Americans, well, then the government could actually investigate that and try to find out why that is taking place. So again, made it illegal for employers to deny a job based to someone based on their race, sex, or religion. He also came up with a big tax cut, and as we said, that Kennedy raised minimum wage. A tax cut will actually be beneficial for the economy as well. Here's why. If you don't have to spend as much money on taxes, that means more money in your wallet. If you have more money in your wallet, it means more trips to Disney, or more trips to the restaurants that you like, or the grocery stores, or to buy a new car. It's more money in your pocket, which means more money spending in the businesses. But then the businesses, they have to pay taxes. So the government is going to get money, but the tax cut encourages spending. He also created the Head Start program. As we talked about with Kennedy, he wanted to try to pass a lot of legislation that would deal with those who were poor, and to try to assist them as far as their education goes. And what this did is this gave preschool for children in poor neighborhoods. And what they were noticing is that in the poor inner city neighborhoods, which a lot of times African Americans lived, that was where the majority of African Americans lived, education wasn't as emphasized. And you had kids that were not starting school until like first grade. And so they were saying, let's try to get an area where we can actually pay for kids to go to school and learn how to read and write, and learn how to do the basics. And they call it Head Start program. We actually still have this program today. I know the city of Flint has Head Start program, and a lot of inner city areas have this program. But the whole idea behind it is to try to get schooling for children in poor neighborhoods, to try to get them to start their education a little bit earlier, and to hopefully get them out of the house, and to hopefully get them to learn how to read and write and those type of things. He also created VISTA, which stands for Volunteers in Service to America. Volunteers in Service to America. This was kind of like his version of the Peace Corps, but the people would stay at home and they would volunteer in the inner city areas. They would volunteer in rural areas. They would volunteer all over the country. And so instead of going outside of the country like the Peace Corps, this group of people would stay inside the country to assist the country in building itself up. And that leads us to the election of 1964. And technically, he's not running for re-election because he wasn't elected in the first place, but he's super popular, and things are going pretty well. Now, the Vietnam War, which I don't know if we'll have time to cover a lot of that, but it hasn't really kicked off just yet. And it's starting to get there. But as he's running for election here to be president, although he is the incumbent, he is the existing president, he does have a lot of momentum. And a lot of people seem to like him, and like a lot of these programs. He's running against a Republican named Barry Goldwater. Goldwater didn't really bring much to the table, except a very awkward picture. But he didn't really bring much to the table as far as politically. Wasn't a bad politician necessarily, but he just didn't really have the momentum that Johnson had. And Johnson had promised that he was going to continue the legacy of President Kennedy and a lot of the programs that he wanted. And so Barry Goldwater is running for Republican, and as I said before, Lyndon Johnson is running for a Democrat. That's a picture of him as the president there. And so these two are both going to run against each other. Now, more than likely, we kind of assumed in the politician or the newspapers, and people pretty much assumed that Johnson was going to win. This was, the buttons. They always passed out the presidential buttons that you would wear on your jackets or whatever, and Goldwater in 64, and then the other one is All the Way. Now, what they were saying is All the Way with LBJ. His name was Lyndon B. Johnson, and they always called him LBJ, just kind of for short, kind of like FDR. And so All the Way with LBJ. And so this is it, but let's look at this political map here of this election. Two things should stand out to you. Johnson just slaughtered him. And the only spots that Barry Goldwater won was the Deep South. And one of the reasons why he won the South was because he wasn't necessarily for desegregation. Barry Goldwater wasn't for integration, let me put it that way, meaning whites and African Americans can go to schools together and that type of thing. And Johnson is trying to actually make integration a normal policy. And so you can see that the Deep South didn't really want integration still. A couple of other things that should stand out to you is this. Look at Florida still doesn't have a ton of electoral votes. New York, Pennsylvania, and Michigan has a decent amount. Ohio, and so you don't have a lot. California, more people are moving out there. Texas, but he wins the Deep South. That'd be Barry Goldwater. But look at this electoral vote: 486 to 52, just killed him. But here it's a little bit closer, although still not that close. Still several votes off, and 70 million people are voting in this election. But President Johnson wins, and he continues on as president. And a couple policies that he's going to pass. The first one is Medicaid, which is medical care for those who cannot afford medical care. And we still have this policy today. A lot of the policies, like I said, Head Start, Medicare, is policies that President Johnson passed, and we still have today. A lot of times, you guys might even know people. Maybe even you guys might be able to qualify for Medicaid, And what it means is basically if you don't make X amount of dollars, then the government will step in and try to help you with your medical bills, meaning they'll tell you you can go to this type of doctor who will accept Medicaid and you won't be charged, instead of $100, you'll only be charged $50. For medicine, you instead of being charged $25, you'll only be charged $12.50, something along those lines. And we still have that today. It's a socialistic type program, but it's something that's benefited millions of Americans. And the other one was Medicare, which is medical care for those who are older, those who are elderly. Generally, your grandparents are probably on Medicare. If they're over the age of, I believe it's 62 and a half is when you can qualify for this. But basically allows an older person who might not have medical benefits from their job because they're not working anymore, the government steps in and allows them to not have to pay as much for medicine and doctor visits and that type of thing. My mom is on Medicare. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. It is just the government's way of helping those who are elderly. And we still have this today. HUD, which stands for the Housing and Urban Development, and the HUD programs, we still have this today. What they were trying to do is create a way that the inner cities could build themselves up. And you can still buy a housing and urban development home or a HUD home. If any of your parents are real estate agents, they're probably familiar with this. And let's say like in the city of Flint, you could get a HUD home loan. Meaning what they're trying to do is they're build up the inner cities. So the government actually like picks up the tab on some of your costs for closing on a house. They would maybe give you a lower interest rate because they want people to move into the inner cities, because they feel like if people move into the inner cities, they're going to want to spend their money on fixing their house up, and they're going to have more stability, and they're going to want to build it up and have less crime. And so we still have housing and urban development today that builds up the cities, the inner cities for housing. And then civil rights were aided as well. That will be our next chapter. Chapter 22 is all focused on civil rights. And so President Johnson really did that. He really was trying to work with Martin Luther King Jr. and a lot of the African American leaders to make their life better. He still struggled as a politician because he knows that if he does that, he's going to probably lose votes, but he is trying his best to aid civil rights as much as he possibly can. And that leads to Chapter 22, Civil Rights in the 60s, and we will cover this later on. You guys will have a quiz over Chapter 21 that I will post, and you guys will take that, and then we'll start 22 here and get moving as quick as possible. At the beginning of next week, I will also be giving you guys your study guide that I had been talking to you guys about to fill out that will basically act as like your exam. Hope you guys have a great afternoon.